Loving God, as swimmers dare to lie face to the sky and water bears them, as hawks rest upon air and air sustains them, so would I learn to attain free fall and float into Creator's deep embrace, knowing no effort earns that all surrounding grace.
Our Old Testament lesson today is from Genesis chapter 33, verses 1 through 17, and I'll be reading from the New International Version. Jacob meets Esau. Jacob looked up, and there was Esau, coming with his 400 men, so he divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and the 2 female servants. He put the female servants and their children in front, Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph in the rear. He himself went on ahead and bowed down to the ground 7 times as he approached his brother. But Esau ran to meet Jacob and embraced him. He threw his arms around his neck and kissed him, and they wept. Then Esau looked up and saw the women and children. "Who are these with you?" he asked. Jacob answered, "They are the children God has graciously given your servant." Then the female servants and their children approached and bowed down. Next, Leah and her children came and bowed down. Last of all came Joseph and Rachel, and they bowed down too. Esau asked, "What's the meaning of all these flocks and herds I met?" "To find favor in your eyes, my lord," he said. But Esau said, "I already have plenty, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." "No, please," said Jacob. "If I have found favor in your eyes, accept this gift from me. For to see your face is like seeing the face of God, now that you have received me favorably. Please accept the present that was brought to you, for God has been gracious to me, and I have all I need." And because Jacob insisted, Esau accepted it. Then Esau said, "Let us be on our way. I'll accompany you." But Jacob said to him, "My Lord knows that the children are tender and that I must care for the ewes and cows that are nursing their young. If they had driven hard just one day, all the animals will die. So let my Lord go on around ahead of his servant, while I move along slowly at the pace of the flocks and herds before me, and the pace of the children until I come to my Lord in Seir." Esau said, "Then let me leave some of my men with you." "But why do that?" Jacob asked. "Just let me find favor in the eyes of my Lord." So that day Esau started on his way back to Seir. Jacob, however, went to Succoth, where he built a place for himself and made shelters for his livestock. That is why the place is called Succoth. Our gospel lesson today is Luke chapter 15, verses 11 through 32. I'm reading from the New International Version, the parable of the lost son. Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of his servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.'"
By the time you're watching this, I will have finally moved to Winchester. At the time I'm recording this, I am still down on Cape Cod, and thus you still have the lovely view of some old bedroom curtains behind me. I hope that by next week's sermon, something around me will be more interesting. We will have a totally different setup entirely. But for now, here we are in the basement for part 2 of a sermon that began last week about Jacob wrestling with an angel at the ford of the Jabbok River. So you might want to go back and watch that at some point. But here we're in part 2, and we remember that Jacob had been heading home blissfully with his large family and all of this wealth, most of which he had gained in less than an honest fashion. But on the way, he had learned that his twin brother Esau had never forgotten that back in their earlier days, Jacob had tricked him out of his birthright and stolen his blessing. And now Esau was marching toward him with 400 armed men. With that looming threat to Jacob's life, the Bible pulls us out of the regular story for a slower pace, a symbolic night of wrestling at the end of Genesis 32. Everything else fades into the background as we watch Jacob struggle with God, with his past, with the fears for his future, his lifelong attempt to be someone that he is not, and to figure out who he, Jacob, really is. He comes out of that dark night with a new name. The angel changes his name from Jacob to Israel. He's blessed, but that blessing has come at a cost. He's limping from the struggle, even though the Bible tells us that he actually emerged the victor, which is really strange when you think about it. Jacob gets the blessing from the angel after the angel tells him that he has, quote, striven with God and with humans and has prevailed. How does that happen? If you take that literally, that could lead to some pretty terrible theology about the nature of God, if even someone as flawed as Jacob could get up and beat God in a wrestling match. But when you realize that the story is a visual representation of Jacob's inner struggle, of his own identity, both as the grandson of Abraham who bears the promise of God, and as someone who has not lived up to that calling, even within his own family, then the whole thing makes more sense. That's what he has beaten. He has beaten his inner demons, if you will, his inner struggles, and he comes forth victorious. It left him wounded, but Jacob comes out of that night with an attitude adjustment and the knowledge not just of his privilege, but of the responsibility to right the wrong he's committed that comes with it. Thus all the gifts that he sends to Esau and the bowing and the I am your servant. He also comes out with the courage to finally get out of the ford and cross the river, and the humility to approach his brother. As the brothers meet, we see that one of the Jewish interpretations of the wrestling match, that Jacob was wrestling not just any angel, but perhaps the guardian angel of Esau, that might well be correct. Perhaps Esau spent the night before searching his own heart for what it meant to be a grandson of Abraham and someone to whom God had also promised a nation of descendants. Was violence toward his brother a way to honor that promise? Should he revel in his brother's humiliation? Should he make him beg? In Genesis 33, verse 4, we're told that instead of any of that, quote, Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. I can't read those words without my mind fast-forwarding about 2,000 years to Jesus telling a parable in Luke chapter 15. We've come to call it the parable of the prodigal son, or sometimes just the parable of the lost son, since it's part of a series of parables in Luke 15 about the importance of finding the lost sheep, the lost coin, and then the chapter ends with the lost son. The parable has so many similarities to this story of Jacob and Esau that I've often wondered if Jesus didn't have it in mind when he told the prodigal son parable. In both cases, you have a wealthy man that has two sons. In both cases, the younger of those sons behaves badly with his inheritance, dishonoring his father and enraging the older brother. In both cases, the younger son arrives at a moment of reckoning when his life is in danger, swallows his pride, and heads for home with a humble heart. And in both cases, that humility is greeted not with gloating or punishment, but with the one who has been harmed the most, running to embrace the wayward son and lifting him back into full relationship. In the world of faith, both of those stories are illustrations of what we call grace. Grace, by definition, is undeserved. It is pure gift. We don't earn grace. You can't earn grace. If you earn it, it's no longer grace, but just something that's owed. And in both of these stories, we're meant to connect the grace given to the younger son with the gift of God. Jacob says to Esau, "For truly to see your face is like seeing the face of God." And in the parable of the prodigal son, the father in the story is meant to represent the way God receives us when we're lost, and when we can finally admit our lostness to ourselves and to others. But both stories also show us that we humans often have trouble with God's amazing grace. In both stories, the God figures, Esau in Genesis and the father in Luke, offer full, extravagant grace. There's no holding back in the embrace, no sense that the one who was harmed has sort of filed away the grievance to pull out at another time. It happened. The one doing the harm has shown through their actions that they recognize the harm that they've caused, they've made restitution, and full relationship is back on the table. The father in Jesus' parable symbolizes that grace with the offer of a ring, a robe, a great feast of welcome, gifts that the prodigal accepts. Grace offered, grace received. Esau backs up his offer of grace with concrete action. Esau says to Jacob, "Let us journey on our way, and I will go alongside you." But Jacob does not accept that offer, saying that, he'd be moving too slowly. No, I couldn't really. I mean, look at how frail everyone is, all the flocks and the herds and the children. I couldn't possibly. They couldn't stand the pace. Never mind that the night before he drove them all across the river while he stayed behind, perhaps into harm's way as they were heading right towards Esau's army. Nope. Esau, you just go on. We weaklings will just hobble along behind you, and we'll meet you in Seir, which is the home of the Edomites, Esau's home. Esau still tries again. "Let me leave with you some of the people who are with me." In other words, a few soldiers then? If you're that weak and tired, maybe you could use some protection out here in the wilderness. Jacob refuses that too. Now, if you had any remaining questions about Esau's motive in wanting to keep an armed force with his brother, given how they began, those questions vanish as Esau doesn't protest Jacob's objections. He just turns around and goes home. And if you thought Jacob was being totally honest in his concern for those weak flocks and herds and children that he had with him, those are erased in the final line of the story, where Jacob does not in fact go to meet his brother in his home of Seir. Neither does he go to the home of their father, but instead he goes to Succoth and builds a house and settles down. This is the last time the twins see each other until they come together again to bury their father at the end of Genesis 35. And with Isaac's death, we see no further connection and contact between the brothers in the Bible. By the end of the Hebrew Scriptures, their descendants are at war. Jacob shows us how hard it is to receive a gift as opposed to an earned wage. Gifts create relationships, and relationships have responsibilities. By accepting a gift, we're accepting some level of relationship with a person. And real relationship asks things of us. It asks that we consider more than just ourselves, that we treat the other fairly, and it acknowledges that our community has expanded, that the circle of those that we consider worthy of mutual time, attention, and care has been drawn more widely. When we accept a gift, we accept that expanded world of relationship and responsibility. When we refuse a gift, we refuse not just a thing or a service, but the relationship that's offered with it, and the responsibility to include the gift giver within our circle of care. My former in-laws were very kind and extremely generous people. But Christmas was always a time when I came away from our celebrations with them wounded, because they could not and would not accept a gift from either me or my husband. One Christmas in particular stood out for me. We'd gone to their Pennsylvania home to spend the holiday. My husband was a university professor, I was a bookstore manager. It was well within our ability to give Christmas gifts to his parents. But we knew how they were. They gave to us extravagantly all the time. But to give back anything, but maybe a thank you, that was another thing entirely. Still, we weren't struggling students anymore, and it was Christmas, so we tried a modest gift. We got a briefcase for his dad, we got a scarf for his mom. Christmas morning, they opened their gifts, they admired them, they said thank you. But when it came time to return home and we went to load the car, there was the briefcase and there was the scarf, there with our belongings. We don't need them. You shouldn't spend your money. It felt to me like a body blow. I didn't really understand then why it hit so hard. It's just things, I thought. Then I thought, well, maybe it's just my own vanity wanting to prove that, hey, I'm on my feet now, I can actually give a gift. And maybe that was mixed in, but it was more. Their refusal to accept even a modest gift when they themselves gave extravagantly sent the message that they were uninterested in any kind of mutual relationship. They were benefactors, and as a recipient, I was somehow less than. They could give or not give as they saw fit. Without them receiving, there was no responsibility. Accepting a gift is accepting responsibility for mutual respect and care. It's a relationship, not a transaction. But for whatever reason, they couldn't do it, and it hurt. Now, after years of walking with congregations, I've seen how those who struggle to receive the gifts of others, whether material gifts or gifts of care and service, also often struggle to fully accept the gift of God's grace. Freely giving and receiving is at the foundation of every single sacrament of the Church, grounded in God's ultimate self-giving in Jesus. What the liturgy and rituals of the Church are supposed to teach us is the lesson that Jacob couldn't quite complete. We don't receive the fullness of the gift unless and until we accept the responsibilities of mutual relationship. Jacob did recognize the enormous grace of his twin and realized that such was the face of God. With grateful relief, he accepted the gift of his life, which Esau could have easily taken, and rightfully so. But for Jacob, it was a one-time deal, a transaction. Jacob returned the wealth and status that he had stolen, and Esau stood down. Esau offered to go further, to accompany and protect his brother and enter the full responsibility of relationship. But Jacob wasn't ready to do that. If he had accepted his brother's offer, Jacob might have avoided one of the ugliest stories in the Bible, which follows in the next chapter. Turning to Jesus' parable, it isn't the prodigal who has the issue here, it's his older brother. And his problem isn't with the receiving. His problem is with the giving. The brother can't distinguish between gifts and wages. He thinks grace must be earned, so he's deeply offended at his father's extravagant welcome of the prodigal. The older brother sees that gift as cheapening what he himself has received from his father over time, because he thinks it's a wage. And so he's sort of measuring and tallying up in his mind who has earned what, and when the deeds don't match the wage, or the wages are equal, he cries foul, because he knows he's been a better son. Grace is not a wage. Grace is a gift. And gifts are about the love of the giver, not the worthiness of the recipient. By definition, you can't earn a gift. The self-giving of God in Jesus is scandalous precisely because it doesn't have to be earned by some heroic act on our part, or even some small act on our part. And when we accept it, we accept both the loving relationship and the responsibilities that go with it. That God would draw a circle of mutual relationship wide enough to include every single one of us, that there is nothing that can possibly ever separate us from the love of God, is the amazing good news that we call the gospel. But if we confuse gifts with wages, we can have trouble with God's extravagant giving to others. If we don't understand ourselves to be God's beloved, we can have trouble receiving the gift. But it doesn't stop there. Zoom out further, and we begin to see not only why we have trouble as individuals, but also why we're so bad in the larger relationships between our various social groups and identities and nations. As a society, we praise individual benefactors, patrons, donors. We value the power conferred by wealth and the discipline required to give some of it up when you're really rich. We actually expect that those with the most wealth will form foundations and give it to others. I remember back in the day when Bill Gates was actually hounded to start his foundation. He had all this money and people were demanding that he give some of it away. But many find it offensive to expect government and even corporate entities to be generous with what they have. We bristle at asking corporations to offer even an appropriate and equally portioned wage, let alone a gift of more vacation time or family leave or better health insurance. Where once workers had relationships with employers, with mutual responsibilities and the giving and receiving of gifts, it's now just all transaction. And woe be unto you if you are not deemed to have earned food assistance or unemployment help or a roof over your head. As a country, any sense of giving has totally left the building. Government gifts are stingy and require the humiliation of the recipient. And to get even that, you have to meet whatever criteria is set for deeming you worthy. It's evident that simply being in need isn't one of those qualifying criteria. In fact, often great need is disqualifying, since too many view poverty as some kind of moral failure. an attitude that has wormed its way into the church in what we've come to call the prosperity gospel. And to talk about restoring wealth to those from whom it was stolen, as Jacob did for Esau, even in that simple transaction for the sake of stopping violence, it's a scandal to mention. The road to healing our relationships at all levels, individually, societally, racially, religiously, nationally, all of that stuff, that requires us to go back to square one, to the gift of life that we received from the one who made us, and discover what it really means, both to give and to receive. Without both pieces of that act, it's really one thing. The act has not happened if there isn't both giving and receiving. Then we're left going our separate ways, like Abraham's twin grandsons, who stopped the violence for now, but which their descendants picked up later on. And without a full understanding of the nature of a gift, we'll remain like the older brother in the parable who's always sort of whining. How come he gets all the good stuff? I've been more faithful than he has. What about me, 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 me? There is joy at the end of this struggle. There is grace. There is the warm embrace of a father for his wayward son and the ability to see the face of God, even in the face of the one marching towards us with a hostile army. But before we can receive that blessing, we have to empty ourselves, enter the ford of the Jabbok, and wrestle with who we are. Wrestle out a new name of the God who meets us there. That's what we'll be doing together over these next weeks. That journey will begin next week, without these curtains, when we'll meet God's Spirit hovering over a formless, chaotic void, when only darkness lay over the face of the deep. I invite you to come with me. Buckle up and join me in the ford of the Jabbok. Angels await, and after the struggle, the amazing grace will lead us home. Amen.
Draw the circle wide. Draw the circle wide.
No one stands alone, we'll stand side by side. Draw the circle wide. Draw the circle wide, draw it wider still. Let this be our song. No one stands alone, standing side by side. Draw the circle wide. Draw the circle wide, draw it wider still. Let this be our song. No one stands alone, standing side by side. Draw the circle wide.
Draw the circle wide. Draw the circle wide. No one stands alone, we'll stand
In gratitude for God's abundant love, evidenced most clearly in the broken body and shed blood of Jesus, we return to God a portion of what has been given to us for God's work in our shared ministry. Friends and members are asked to prayerfully consider giving in support of Crawford's ministries and operations. You can give electronically by clicking the button in the weekly messenger or on our website, or you can mail a check to 34 Dick Street, Winchester, Mass. 01890. Thank you.
It is no coincidence that the root word of whole, health, heal, holy is hail. If we are healed, we become whole. We are hale and hearty. We are holy. The marvelous thing is that this holiness is nothing we can earn. We don't become holy by acquiring merit badges and brownie points. It has nothing to do with virtue or job descriptions or morality. It is nothing we can do in this do-it-yourself world. It is a gift, sheer gift, waiting there to be recognized and received. We do not have to be qualified to be holy. We do not have to be qualified to be whole or healed.